Hey everyone. Have you guys ever noticed how we treat boredom like some kind of emergency? Like the moment there's nothing to do, we reach for something. A phone, a video, music, a game, a conversation, just anything. It does not even matter what it is. All that matters is that the silence is gone and the empty space is filled and the boredom is once again defeated. But what's strange is that humans have spent most of history being bored. Back then, waiting was normal, silence was normal, daydreaming was normal. Yet today, despite having more entertainment than any generation in history, boredom feels more unbearable than ever. So, why is that? I mean, why do we treat boredom like a problem that needs to be solved immediately? And what if boredom isn't actually the problem at all? What if the real problem is what boredom forces us to confront when all the distractions finally disappear? If boredom is such a natural part of being human, then why do we treat it like it's an emergency? I mean, okay, think about what happens when we're forced to wait. We're standing in line at a grocery store, 5 seconds pass, out comes the phone. We're sitting at a doctor's office, out comes the phone. We're riding in a car, music. We're eating alone, video. We're in the bathroom, believe it or not, phone. It's almost automatic. It is for me. I do this all the freaking time. What's fascinating though is that we often reach for these distractions before we've even given ourselves this chance to feel bored or to hear silence or to hear nothing, I should say, right? We don't wait to see if boredom arrives. We just assume it will, and then we prepare for it like we're preparing for bad weather or something. But this raises an interesting question to me, because you know, if boredom is so terrible, then how did humans survive with it for thousands of years? Because for most of human history, people spent huge portions of their lives waiting for crops to grow, waiting for letters to arrive, waiting for news from distant relatives, waiting through long winters and long journeys, waiting for their friends to show up. So somehow humanity did survive all that boredom, all that waiting. And, when you think about it, many of the greatest ideas, stories, inventions, and discoveries were born during moments when people had nothing else to do except just sit there and think. So, what I'm trying to say is maybe boredom itself isn't the problem. Maybe, what's changed is our tolerance for it. I mean, we've spent years training ourselves to expect constant stimulation. Every question can be answered instantly. Every quiet moment can be filled. Every spare second can be occupied. And once you get used to that level of stimulation, even a few minutes of stillness can start to feel uncomfortable. So, was boredom always this bad? I mean, was it? At first glance, it might seem like the answer is yes. After all, boredom isn't a modern invention. Human beings have always experienced it. But what has changed, I think, is our relationship with it. Because, I mean, let's go back 100 years ago or even a few hundred years ago. Yeah, let's go back a few hundred years ago. Imagine living a few hundred years ago. No television, no internet, no podcasts, no video games, no endless stream of content designed to hold your attention. Large portions of life were spent waiting for weather to change, waiting for crops to grow, waiting for news to travel from one town to another, waiting for a letter that might take weeks or even months to arrive. But people still found ways to entertain themselves. Of course they did. They told stories, they played games, they sang songs, they spent time with family and friends. But there were also long stretches where there simply just wasn't much happening. And for me, today, that world feels almost unimaginable. Most of us carry more entertainment in our pockets than entire civilizations had access to throughout history. If we're waiting for a friend, at the coffee shop, we scroll. If we're standing in line at the grocery store, we scroll. If we're bored for 30 seconds, we take out our phone and scroll. We've become so accustomed to constant stimulation that even small moments of quiet can feel uncomfortable. The question, I think, is whether boredom has actually become worse or whether we've simply become less willing to experience it. Maybe boredom just hasn't changed at all, and we're the ones that have changed. I mean, I noticed this in my own life. When I was a kid, I had far fewer ways to entertain myself than I do now. I mean, yeah, I had television. My mom got cable and stuff, so I was watching TV and stuff. I was born in the early 90s, so we had cable at the time. I had books, I had a dog, I had my imagination, but I spent hours daydreaming. Like, I feel like when I was, I'd get bored, but I would just go into my own mind. I would spend hours just making up stories, hours sitting around with my dog, reading a book. Like, I would just get lost in a book as a kid. I would spend hours, watching like low stimulation TV. Um, Sometimes I'd get so lost in my own thoughts that I wouldn't even notice how much time had passed. And I'd entertain myself by playing games, like I'd pretend that my fingers were a gun and I'd be running all around my room, with my dog just playing. Or I would make up a whole world in my mind. But today, and I'm a writer, so it's, I still love to world build, but it's so much harder now, even when I've got all these good ideas. Today, if a social media app goes down for a little while, I sometimes catch myself thinking, like, okay, what the hell do I do with myself now? And that's crazy because when I'm on social media, I'm so overstimulated that I'm not even happy being on it. Like, I'm more happy reading a book. I mean, I'm a book reviewer. It's my job. I read, like, copies of books that I get for free, and I get to read them, and I get lost in them, and I love it. And then, sometimes I'll put off doing that, even though it's so much more fun than being on Instagram. But I'll spend hours on Instagram, and I'm not even happy being on Instagram. And it's so strange when I think about it. I have access to more entertainment, information, and distractions than I ever did as a kid, yet my tolerance for boredom is so much lower. Like, when I was a kid, I had to wait for a song that I liked on the radio to come on. Now I have access to like every song ever on YouTube that I could just, type it in and hear it. It it's crazy. Um, it just makes me wonder so much all the time whether my tolerance for boredom has, really, if it's always been like that, or if um, boredom itself is just the same and I've changed. Um, like, it seems like we've just gotten used to never experiencing boredom. Like, back in the day, at least when I was a kid, and a lot of people I know that are my age, we didn't have smartphones and stuff like that. So, um, you know, I feel like we were, like, we would go on the internet, but it was like more of an experience. Like, there would be like a family computer in one room. It wasn't like the internet was in your pocket everywhere you went. And I think, back then I was used to being bored, so it wasn't the worst thing for me. So when I would feel bored, I'd be like, okay, I'm bored. Let me go clean or let me go entertain myself in some way. Now I'm like, oh my God, I'm bored. Why am I bored? This is the worst feeling ever. I can't be bored. I have to, do something. I need to entertain myself. So, what does boredom actually do? I mean, okay, most of us think of boredom as this useless feeling, right? Something to avoid, something to eliminate. We have to omit boredom from our lives immediately. We cannot be bored for 1 minute. I, at least that's how I am. I cannot be bored for 1 minute. That's how I feel. Something that just gets in the way of living our lives. If I'm bored, that means I'm doing nothing. I'm not being productive. I should be getting up and moving. I should be, taking care of something. I should be grinding in some way. But what if we just slow down for a second and realize that, you know, maybe boredom's not a flaw. Maybe it's like a feature, you know? Okay, like think about what happens when there's nothing demanding your attention. No notifications, no videos, no conversations, no distractions. At first, it probably does feel uncomfortable for most of us. I know for me it does. But then something interesting starts to happen. Your mind begins to wander. You start remembering things you haven't thought about in years, inside jokes from when you were like 15. Um, you start making connections between ideas. You begin reflecting on problems you've been avoiding. You start imagining things. So, in other words, you begin thinking, right? Many of the things we value most as human beings happen during these moments, I think. You really think about it. Creativity, reflection, self awareness, problem solving, storytelling, even many scientific discoveries and artistic breakthroughs, they began when someone had enough quiet space to just let their mind wander. It's difficult to daydream when you're constantly being entertained. It's difficult to reflect when you're constantly being distracted. It's difficult to hear your own thoughts when something else is always talking, music, a video, something else. And just maybe that's why boredom has survived for so long. Because it's still there no matter what. Maybe it's a signal. It's something that says, there's nothing happening right now. Why don't you spend some time with your own mind? And I think sometimes that's exactly what makes boredom so valuable, as much as I hate it. Not because it's enjoyable, it's not enjoyable, but because it creates a space that almost nothing else can. A space where your attention just finally belongs to you and only you. So, what if boredom just isn't the thing that we actually hate? I mean, think about it just for a second. I mean, if boredom were truly the problem, then any distraction should solve it in theory, right? And okay, for a little while, it usually does. We scroll, we watch, we listen, we consume. But then most of us still feel so restless and even overstimulated. We still feel dissatisfied. We still feel like there's something missing. So maybe boredom isn't the enemy we've made it out to be? Maybe the real issue is what boredom forces us to confront. Because when all of those distractions disappear, we're left with something that most of us spend our whole lives avoiding, and that's ourselves. Our thoughts, our fears, our regrets, our unanswered questions, the things we'd just rather push aside and not think about. And when you're busy, you can postpone those things. When you're entertained, you can drown them out. They're not there, they don't exist. When you're constantly stimulated, you get to keep them at arm's length. But I don't know, man. Boredom has a way of removing all of those escape routes. Like suddenly there's nothing between you and your own mind. Maybe that's why some people would rather scroll endlessly than just sit quietly for, I don't know, 10 minutes. Maybe that's why silence is so unsettling sometimes. Maybe that's why we reach for these distractions almost automatically. Not because boredom's painful, but because self reflection can oftentimes be painful. And I think, it's strange because the thoughts we avoid don't disappear. They just wait for us. They come out in dreams, they come out when we're seriously forced to be bored. Your phone dies on the train, and then suddenly you're like, oh crap, I have nothing to do, I have nothing to look at. So the longer we avoid these things, though, the louder they just end up being, just, later on when we don't have a choice but to confront them. So maybe boredom serves this purpose that we don't really acknowledge. Maybe it creates a moment where we can finally hear ourselves. This moment where we're forced to ask questions that we'd otherwise just push aside. Questions about who we are, what we really want in life, what we're afraid of, where we're going. Maybe boredom isn't an obstacle to life. Maybe it's one of the very few moments when life stops long enough for us to actually examine it. But then at the end of the day, why is boredom treated like such a disaster? Why do I treat boredom like it's a disaster when I can sit here and say all of this? Is it because we've been accustomed to a world where every moment can be filled? Or is it something else? You know, every silence can be interrupted, every question can be answered. Okay, not every question, but most questions. Every spare second can be occupied though. But boredom was never meant to be eliminated, I don't think. I mean, I think it serves a purpose. Boredom is the space where ideas are born. The space where reflection happens, the space where we say, I don't like this thing about myself. I'm going to try and work on it. The space where we finally hear our own thoughts. Maybe that's why so many of us rush to escape it. Not because boredom is this empty feeling, but because it's the opposite. It's not empty. Because beneath all that boredom is questions, thoughts, fears, dreams, possibilities, just waiting for our attention. So the next time that you find yourself reaching for a distraction, just, pause for a moment. Just 1 minute. Set a timer on your phone if you have to. Ask yourself, though, what would happen if I allowed myself to be bored? And you might discover that boredom isn't the absence of something. It's actually, it could be the beginning of something. So, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed. Um, until next time, this has been Hidden Observer. Thanks for watching. See ya.